Over the last decade, there's been one project that has been practically unbuildable in Canada: pipelines. This has certainly not been the case for most of the last 100 years. Canada spent the better part of a century building hundreds of thousands of kilometers of them, with most of their capacity carrying oil and natural gas to the United States. Now that the trade partnership between Canada and the US is unreliable, people are asking why, oh why, did we not simply build pipelines across Canada? As with so many things, the finger comes back to point at Justin Trudeau. Except, Trudeau did build pipelines. Their construction looked like this.
Pipeline is a tar sands pipeline.
Shame on you! What are you gonna tell your grandkids?
So let's talk about pipelines. Why hasn't Canada connected sea to shining sea with them? Why did the majority of the pipelines proposed during Stephen Harper's reign end up cancelled? And as public support for pipelines increases, should we really be building them now? Canada has been building pipelines in earnest since the 1940s, when significant oil reserves were discovered in Alberta. Starting in the 70s and persisting through the following 40 years or so, pipelines were built or expanded to deliver natural gas and oil throughout Canada, but primarily to refineries in the United States. Today, Canada has built over 840,000 kilometers of pipelines from Canada throughout the US. Understanding the situation surrounding pipelines today means looking at the convergence of economic, environmental, and social factors that led rapidly to an intention to build a lot of pipelines, and then just as rapidly, a decline in that desire. Stephen Harper became Prime Minister with a coherent vision on how to create a booming economy, make Canada an energy superpower by extracting, transporting, and selling as much oil as humanly possible. When Harper was first elected in 2006, oil was around $100 a barrel, so that plan made sense. He proposed or advanced a few pipelines: the Keystone XL that would run to the US, the Northern Gateway pipeline which would bring oil to BC's west coast, and Energy East, which you've probably heard of, which would go through Ontario and Quebec on its way to terminals in New Brunswick. What followed is a tremendous case of irony. Stephen Harper's government took a largely hostile stance towards environmental regulation, culminating in their famous decision to leave the Kyoto Protocol in 2011. At a time when the world needed to be convinced that Canada was capable of responsibly handling an oil boom, and south of the border, then President Barack Obama was attempting to build a legacy around things such as healthcare and climate policy, Harper's government attempted to remove regulations around oil and gas, decrease public involvement and consultations in large projects like pipelines, ignore Indigenous communities, and antagonize climate activists.
This morning, Secretary Kerry informed me that after extensive public outreach and consultation with other cabinet agencies, the State Department has decided that the Keystone XL pipeline would not serve the national interests of the United States.
Back in 2011, Obama told Harper that he was pausing approval on the Keystone XL pipeline due to economic and environmental factors, something that surprised Harper. Harper then began to doubt whether the US would buy as much oil as Canada could produce, and began pursuing other pipeline projects in order to ship Canadian oil to other partners. But the Harper government's approach on environmental issues drew exactly the wrong kind of attention to the oil sands and pipelines. The result was that municipalities, provinces, Indigenous communities, environmental groups, individual citizens, and other nations stopped looking at Canadian pipelines as necessary infrastructure projects that would greatly boost the economy, open new trade corridors, and create jobs, but as damaging environmental projects that needed to be closely watched and criticized. While it's certainly not just Harper's fault, the oil sands became ubiquitous with pollution, not just in Canada but internationally. Beyond the oil sands themselves, and the risks of leaks along pipelines, the end destinations became an environmental PR disaster as well. The terminal at the end of Northern Gateway, where oil tankers would set out to serve global markets, was next to a rainforest. Increased tanker traffic at Energy East's terminal was found to be potentially harmful to endangered beluga whale populations, one of the cutest whales. The second thing that happened was that between 2014 to 2016, oil prices crashed, meaning that huge pipeline projects didn't necessarily even make sense anymore economically, while at the same time increasing the necessity for them, as transporting oil by train was far too expensive. The only pipeline that was actually built under Harper was part of the original Keystone pipeline, which almost exclusively served the US market. Enter Justin Trudeau. Trudeau entered office with 4 main domestic pipeline ideas floating around: Trans Mountain, Line 3, Energy East, and Northern Gateway. Harper had previously approved Northern Gateway, but a federal court had blocked it after finding they had not properly consulted Indigenous groups. Trudeau chose not to pursue further action on that pipeline, instead approving Trans Mountain and Line 3, which was largely a modernization of an existing Enbridge pipeline. Before we talk about those, let's talk about Energy East, because politicians and the media love to talk about it as if they just don't understand how it didn't get built, saying Energy East would have redirected tens of billions of dollars away from the US. Energy East was proposed in 2013 by Irving Oil's patriarch Arthur Irving. It faced protests almost immediately, and heavy delays, first from said protests, and then from the changeover from Harper to Trudeau. But it wasn't simply protesters. The pipeline was set to cross over the territory of 180 different Indigenous groups, most of whom opposed the pipeline. Beyond that, the pipeline was going to pass through North Bay, Kenora, and Thunder Bay, all of which opposed it. But while environmentalists take credit for canceling the projects, and they had a role, I'm sure, the project was cancelled by TransCanada, the company that owned it, in 2017, and the biggest factor may have been economics. Between when the project was announced and when it was cancelled, the price of oil fell from $106 per barrel to $39. But let's look at a pipeline that did get built: Trans Mountain. The Trans Mountain pipeline was actually built in the 50s, but by the 2010s it only had a capacity of 300,000 barrels per day. In 2013, Kinder Morgan, a Texas-based company which owned the pipeline, applied for an expansion of the line to transport 890,000 barrels per day, essentially twinning the original line, as well as adding around 1,000 kilometers of new pipeline. The pipeline was estimated to cost $5.4 billion and begin operation in 2017. That is not what happened. The pipeline met resistance from Indigenous groups and from provincial governments. A newly elected NDP Green coalition in BC in 2017 said they would use every tool in the toolbox to stop the project. Sites where construction workers were doing surveys were covered in protesters, leading to several arrests, including that of Green Party leader Elizabeth May. Despite Trudeau insisting he had sign-off from all affected Indigenous groups, many felt the government's consultations did not adequately address Indigenous rights. In April 2018, Kinder Morgan paused work and threatened to walk away, unless the government explained how they could build the pipeline through BC when BC was still opposed to the project.
When we're faced with an exceptional situation that puts jobs at risk, that puts our international reputation on the line, our government's prepared to take action. To guarantee the summer construction season for the workers who are counting on it, and to ensure the project is built to completion in a timely fashion, the federal government has reached an agreement with Kinder Morgan to purchase the existing Trans Mountain pipeline and the infrastructure related to the Trans Mountain expansion project.
Reaction is pouring in from across the country today and here on the West Coast after a huge court decision and a massive blow to the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion project. The Federal Court of Appeal ruled the National Energy Board's review of the project was flawed, and the Canadian government didn't adequately consult with First Nations before giving the project the green light.
Today, I am announcing that our government has newly approved the Trans Mountain expansion project going forward. The company plans to have shovels in the ground this construction season.
We are all of the view to dismiss the appeal for the unanimous reasons of the Court of Appeal for British Columbia.
Between the delays, protests, legal battles, stops and starts, and all of the other hurdles, the project went from a price tag of $5.4 billion and a completion date of late 2017 to a final price tag of $34 billion and an operating date of May 1st, 2024. But the point is, Trans Mountain was a simple pipeline project. Yet still, two governments, taking two completely different approaches to try to get it built, still ended up billions of dollars and several years over budget due to resistance from just about every possible avenue available. So why don't we build pipelines in Canada? Because Canadians, from citizens up through basically every level of government, have vehemently and sometimes violently opposed them. And they are such volatile projects that getting the approvals from everyone affected by them has become an arduous task. But the public narrative has largely blamed the federal government. And a lot of that is because of Bill C-69, which has been dubbed the No New Pipelines Law by conservatives. The act is actually called the Impact Assessment Act, and although it could theoretically limit the construction of pipelines, it is in no way an act specifically geared towards pipelines. What the act does do, or did do, was give the federal government the power to veto large projects like coal mines or oil sands projects if it deems they are not in the public interest. But while Pierre Poilievre is still using this act politically, it has largely been neutered. Alberta won a Supreme Court case in 2023 that called the act unconstitutional, saying it infringed on the division of power between the federal government and the provinces, finding that climate change and emissions targets were not grounds for the federal government to take authority over provincial projects. It did, however, affirm the federal government's ability to undertake environmental assessments, as long as they don't infringe on constitutional divisions of power. So, this act is technically still in force, under different rules from when originally written. It has become a political talking point far more than it has been a pipeline killer. But the final question we need to ask is this. As of March 2025, there has been about a 10% increase nationwide in favorability for pipelines. Let's say suddenly Canadians are fully on board with new pipelines. Quebec and Ontario formally agree to Energy East, and we can get building. Should we do it? The answer to that, as you may have guessed, is complicated. On the one hand, oil and gas are Canada's largest exports by far. Almost all of that oil and gas goes to the United States, bringing in hundreds of billions of dollars a year. In Europe, instability has caused a need for natural gas, which in the future will be met by increased production in countries like Azerbaijan. If Canada could have a pipeline from Alberta to St. John, New Brunswick, we could service the European market, unlock new trade routes, diversify our trading partners, as well as contribute to interprovincial trade and energy security domestically. Of course, there are a number of potential environmental drawbacks, but for the purpose of this video, we are going to ignore those for the time being. But this is not the 1950s. The first version of the Trans Mountain Pipeline took only 2 years to build. That simply does not happen today. And although Canadians are looking more favorably towards pipelines than they did a year ago, even in a best-case scenario, a project like Energy East would take the better part of a decade to build. And that is if it isn't bogged down by protests, provincial resistance, construction issues, labor shortages, etc., etc. Depending on who you believe, the global peak of oil demand has either already occurred or is coming in the next 10 years. Is it worth it for Canada to build a pipeline that takes 5 to 7 years and costs tens of billions of dollars simply to transport a resource that is set to see a global decline in the coming decades? Not to mention that Canada is in the midst of a trade war now, not 5 to 7 years from now. A pipeline like Energy East simply is not the solution to the problems we are currently facing. And if we take the recent Trans Mountain extension as a reference, the likelihood Energy East would even be completed by 2035 is a toss-up. It doesn't even make sense economically, unless you're an oil and gas lobbyist. Solar and wind energy are now the lowest cost of new energy generation, not to mention that Canada's economy has been tied closely to the price of oil for decades. The great irony is that Stephen Harper was right. The decade that he was in power was the time to build pipelines. He could not have known the future uncertainty that would come with the United States, or the need to diversify our allies and trade partners. But he knew how important oil was to Canada. But by trying to build those pipelines at all costs, he created a new cost that has not been overcome to this day: controversy. The social and political costs of pipelines became too great. And now, when public sentiment is finally turning in the face of a crisis, building new pipelines cannot solve our current problems and doesn't even make sense. But pipelines, like so many other things, are no longer even about pipelines. They're about politics, about the political allegiance between oil companies, Alberta, and the federal Conservatives, but trying to sway public opinion to get votes. The next Prime Minister may very well put tens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money towards a new pipeline, spurred on by big oil companies and the provinces that need them. That money could be much better spent on just about any other energy project. While hindsight is 20/20, the time to build pipelines was 10 years ago. Canada's next leader shouldn't dwell on what could have been in the past, and instead look towards not just diversifying our trade partners, but diversifying our economy away from oil and gas. And that means that for the first time in a long time, defying public sentiment might mean not building pipelines.